Where are the handouts up to? Has anyone got the big pile of them? Oh, they're at the back, right. For those of you that have just come in, there's some handouts floating around. Okay, we'll get started at 5 past. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to Between War and Peace, the second lecture for today. Today we're going to be looking at just war theory. Before I say anything more, I have got an important announcement. So I know you all loved the rooms that we were in for the seminars, but we have managed to move the rooms. So it's a bit complicated. I'm going to post this up on Blackboard. For those of you that are Group 1, I can't remember who's in which group, but for those of you that are in Group 1, 11 to 12 tutorial, nice and easy for you, you're just going to be in Mansfield Cooper 3.01. These are hopefully rooms that have all got desks and all got the heating, so, or air conditioning if need be. Then for those of you that are in Group 2, which is the Friday 1 to 2 tutorial, these are all of them, apart from one in Alan Turing, G.113. I'm not sure where these are. We'll find them together. Well, we won't find them together. Apart from, there's 1 week, Positive Incentives Week, that's the week after reading, where we're in Simon. If you ever get up into Simon, those are the best rooms. You've got a nice, it's a bit of an effort getting up there, but they're lovely big rooms. Week after reading. And then, apologies for those of you in the final group, because you're going to find that you're a little bit trekking all over the place, mostly in University Place, reading week, and then you'll see 4.213 1 week, and then a couple more. So after reading week, it changes. But good news is we've escaped from those. From the hell that was wherever it was we were. Okay, I'm going to post this up on Blackboard. I imagine people will still turn up to the old place, but anyway, this hopefully will be a bit better. I'll leave it up there in case you want to copy it down. Can you all see that all right? Okay, where are we up to with the handouts? Who needs a handout? So this week we're going to be looking at just war theory. In the previous week, last lecture, I introduced the course and gave a presentation on the responsibility to protect the R2P doctrine. And this is the predominant way that responses to mass atrocities are framed. So this week we're going to be looking at just war theory. We're going to be doing so for 2 main reasons. The first is because just war theory helps us to understand what is wrong with war and the need for the alternatives to it. So what we're going to be doing is look at the critique of war provided by just war theory. The second is because just war theory helps provide a very clear set of criteria for judging the justifiability of wars, and some argue we can apply these criteria to look at the alternatives we're going to be looking at in later weeks. So some of the concepts and ideas that we're going to look at today you should find useful for the later weeks. So the lecture aims to outline the principles of just war theory, and in particular the principles of jus ad bellum, which we'll be doing more in the first part of the lecture, and the principles of what are called jus in bello. And in doing so, we're going to try to understand why just war theorists reject war in many cases. Now, before I say anything more, this is obviously a pretty hot topic given what's gone on the news over the past 24 hours. You'll find that there's lots of just war theorists on Twitter lamenting the various wars that are going on. So saying that Iran's attack on Israel is illegal and unjustified, and Israel's attack on Lebanon is wrongful and unjustified. We're not going to explore, obviously, that in detail today, but just to give you a sense that just war theorists are commenting already on the justifiability of those wars. And what we're going to be doing today is trying to understand in more detail why they might be viewed as morally wrong. Okay. So some of you might have considered just war theory today before. What we're going to try and do is look at it from a slightly different angle. But before we do that, there should be some lecture handouts floating around. Let me explain what just war theory is. So to explain what just war theory is, I want you to think about the intervention in Libya in 2011. And I mentioned this last week. It started in the context of the Arab Spring with uprisings against the rule of Colonel Gaddafi. Gaddafi appeared to crack down on the protesters harshly and threatened to bomb, in particular, the citizens of Benghazi. In response, the UK, France, and the US led a bombing campaign which had the authorization of the UN Security Council. The campaign, in turn, became controversial because it was alleged that first, the coalition did not take sufficient precaution and ended up harming civilians. And the second is that the intervention went on to be regime change. There's some handouts still floating around somewhere. Now, the Foreign Affairs Committee Select Report was extremely critical of the intervention for those reasons. Now, I want you to think about two issues. First, do you think the situation in Libya was sufficiently serious to warrant humanitarian intervention? The just war theorist Michael Walzer, whose works we're going to consider today, doubted this. He argued that a military attack of the sort now in progress is only permissible in extreme circumstances. So he didn't think it was sufficiently extreme to warrant humanitarian intervention, this threat to the citizens of Benghazi. On the other hand, you might think the situation was sufficiently serious, given that, according to some, Gaddafi appeared to indicate that his regime was going to commit an atrocity. He said that something like no mercy, gave a famous no mercy speech, where he called on the supporters to go out and cleanse the city of Benghazi. And various commentators read into that there was going to be mass atrocities. So, was the situation sufficiently serious? Secondly, how much does it matter if the intention of the coalition was regime change to get rid of Gaddafi, rather than trying to protect civilians? Now, the dangers of regime change are generally greater than protecting the dangers with protection of civilians, but some argue that sometimes regime change is necessary in order to protect civilians. Thirdly, the intervention in Libya largely relied on air power, and this reliance on air power was very controversial. On the one hand, there were no reported NATO casualties, just like in the intervention in Kosovo. But on the other hand, an investigation in 2011 by the New York Times of airstrikes found that at least 40 civilians and perhaps more than 70 were killed by NATO at these sites. And the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee Select Report, if you're interested, goes into detail on that. Okay, so let me try and get the mouse click. That's helpful. The mouse is not plugged in.
Next, two takes on the war in Libya, beginning with the latest bombing by NATO forces. Angus Walker of Independent Television News reports from Tripoli.
For half an hour, NATO airstrikes blasted targets near Colonel Gaddafi's compound. It was the heaviest bombardment of central Tripoli for more than 2 weeks. NATO said it hit a vehicle compound used for resupplying Gaddafi's troops. Libyan government officials took camera crews to a nearby hospital, showing reporters 3 dead and claiming 150 were injured.
We have 3 martyrs so far. The injured have been taken to 2 different hospitals. This is one of them. Some of them, of course, were treated and they have gone home already because of their light injuries. Some have bigger, more serious injuries. Some have died, of course, as you have seen.
NATO has been expanding its range of targets in central Tripoli, hitting Colonel Gaddafi's fortified compound, intelligence headquarters and naval vessels in the city's harbour. The bombing campaign is into its 3rd month, and yet the Libyan regime clings onto power. NATO rejects claims that it has lost momentum. Now it's understood that if the decision is taken, 3 Apache helicopters on board HMS Ocean in the Mediterranean will go into action. Another 2 are on standby in the UK. The helicopters are expected to enforce a 16-mile buffer zone around Misrata to prevent Libyan artillery hitting the recently besieged city. NATO is trying to find a way to finish what it started.
The problem with most
Okay. So what I want you to think about is whether it's acceptable to cause some unintended civilian casualties if they're unavoidable when trying to secure a morally valuable end, such as, say, tackling mass killing. Or should one refrain from killing innocents, even if this means that one doesn't intervene and in the end more people die? These are tricky questions, and just war theory helps us to answer them. It helps us to judge whether a particular instance of war is or was justified. It helps us to determine, for instance, whether NATO has or had just cause for its intervention in Libya, and whether regime was an acceptable intention. And it helps to provide guidance for how war should be carried out, such as how much care interveners must take when conducting bombing campaigns. In short, it provides a set of moral restrictions on warfare. Now, some of you might be thinking that the idea of a just war that provides moral restrictions seems crazy. Surely war is always wrong. Alternatively, some of you might be thinking there can't be any restrictions on war. Remember, there's a famous proverb, all is fair in love and war. So these are 2 extremes. At one extreme is pacifism. On a pacifist position, war is never justified. Regardless of the evil that you're confronting, pacifism requires that you refrain from war. So on the pacifist approach, it was wrong to intervene in Kosovo, despite the impending ethnic cleansing of the Kosovan Albanians. Wrong to launch the first Gulf War to restore Kuwait's sovereignty. Wrong to intervene in Libya. Wrong to launch World War II. Wrong to in defense against the Nazis. wrong for Ukraine to wage war in self-defense. Now, we're going to consider the various types of pacifism in week 5, and I want to caveat by what I've just said, that some pacifists do step back from these claims a bit. But for now, to simplify on the most simple version of pacifism, they reject that war in the current circumstances, could be justifiable. At the other extreme is realism, that I'm sure many of you come across. Again, lots of different sorts of realism. To simplify, on the realist position, anything goes in war, providing it's in the national interest. So South Africa would do nothing wrong, for instance, if it invaded East Swatini, which is the country formerly known as Swaziland, if it's going to be in the national security interests of South Africa. And there wouldn't be any restrictions on what it could do during the war when invading East Swatini. It could target women and children in order to secure a particularly quick surrender. That's the realist position. Or you might think in terms of that's a hypothetical one, or you might think more likely that Venezuela would not do anything wrong if it invaded Guyana, if it's going to be in the national interest of Venezuela. Now, by contrast, just war theory argues that there are limitations on when and how we can wage war, but accepts that sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. So it's, if you like, a midway between these two extremes of realism and pacifism. Now, what I want to highlight in particular for this lecture is that in being this midway between realism and pacifism, it provides a critique of war. It says that some wars are not morally permissible, and they're wrong because they fail to meet 3 sets of criteria.
Next.
These are restrictions on when we can go to war, what you can do during war, and what you can do after war. So the first set of restrictions are jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum. It's really important that you get the Latin right. Jus ad bellum. I know it sounds pernickety, but it looks, when it comes to your assessments, make sure you get the Latin right. Jus ad bellum. Before war. These are the criteria you consider before going to war. Jus in bello. These are the criteria for during war. Criteria for how you can permissibly wage war. For instance, you can't intentionally target civilians. And the third set of criteria are jus post bellum. And this is what you can do after war. If we are successful, there are limitations on how we should behave as the victor, for instance. You should have a post-war transition that's justified. Now, this third set of criteria, the jus post bellum, you don't really need to worry about. I'm not going to say much about them today in today's lecture or generally for the whole module. And the reason why is their place within just war theory is somewhat controversial, and there's a lot less work that develops how we should think about them. We're going to focus on the first two, with jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus post bellum is really about peace rather than the war, so we're going to focus on the first two. Okay, so jus ad bellum, jus in bello. Okay, 4 more points. Just war theory has a long historical pedigree, and it's often framed as a Western Catholic doctrine, starting from medieval thinkers such as Augustine, Aquinas, Grotius, then through to kind of more modern ones, Kant's, and so on. Then more recently, Michael Walzer, Cecile Fabre, whose work we're going to be looking at quite a bit in this module, and Jeff McMahon, who I'm going to say something about later today. In fact, just war theory is often called a tradition. This is because there's been a convergence around certain sets of criteria that most thinkers think are important. And these are the ones we're going to look at today. But what we want you to bear in mind that although there is convergence around certain principles, there's also a lot of disagreement on how to understand them in particular and their relative importance. So throughout the ages, they've all come up with their own accounts of just war theory with different weights to different principles. That's the first point, the tradition. Secondly, there are different wings of just war theory. So some, such as Eshday, are much closer to the realist wing, much more hawkish, think that a lot of wars are justified. Eshday famously defended the 2003 war in Iraq. On the other hand, sorry for my terrible diagram here. On the other hand, there's more of a pacifist wing. That's Cecile Fabre. Photos. These photos are all from like years ago, by the way, so they don't actually look like them. That's Cecile Fabre. Again, we're going to be looking at her over the next few weeks. She's more towards the pacifist wing, who think that most wars are unjustified and only very few are potentially justified. Okay, this brings me to my third point. Very often, just war theory is viewed as a Western and specifically Catholic tradition. But with moves to decolonize the subject and to study non-Western approaches, scholars are increasingly recognizing that there's a very rich non-Western basis to just war theory as well. There are different forms of just war theory or the ethics of war, for instance, in African political theory, Confucianism, Buddhism, Islam, Indian traditions, Orthodox Christianity. So a lot of the major moral and religious traditions have got various forms of the ethics of war or just war thinking. Indeed, there are two very interesting recent books on the different international perspectives on just war that I've added to the reading list this year. One's currently on order for the library, and one hopefully will be in soon. So. Yeah, that one's on order, but that weirdly the more recent one is already in. But anyway. Okay, let's look at the example of the African just war theory. This emphasizes the notion of harmony and communal bonds. And from this, there develops an account of just war theory that is, according to Thaddeus Metz, emphasizing, for instance, waging war in collective self-defense to help other societies under threat. Collective self-defense to help other societies under threat. He quotes Nelson Mandela from Long Walk to Freedom about the decision to found Spear of the Nation, the military wing of the ANC. Mandela says, violence would begin whether we initiated it or not. Would it not be better to guide this violence ourselves according to the principles where we save lives by attacking symbols of oppression and not people? So this is a core element of certain strands of just war theory. War is likely, so it's better to sometimes guide it rather than to eschew all moral principles. It's better to try and guide war rather than to say it's never going to happen. Mandela also said at the famous Riviera trial that it was only when all else had failed, when channels of peaceful protest had been barred to us, that the decision was made to embark on violent forms of political struggle. Here we see something like a principle of last resort that we're going to look at shortly. Another example is in the Confucian tradition. In this tradition, Mencius offers the richest account of just war theory. And according to Mencius, the paradigmatic case for just war was a war of rebellion to secure the needs of the people, or humanitarian intervention, if you like, similarly to defend the rights of the people. States with sufficiently bad governance, he argues, were legitimate targets of intervention. So this sounds quite similar to what we looked at last week, which was the responsibility to protect, where states that fail to protect their populations from mass atrocities forfeit their sovereignty. Okay, so I want you to bear this in mind, that although it's often framed, in particularly some of the older readings, as this Catholic Western doctrine, it's now no longer seen as such, and there's a lot of interesting work arguing that the ethics of war and just war theory important non-Western traditions too. Okay, the fourth point before we're going to have a quick break is that the critique of war implied by just war theory is wrong because it doesn't meet those criteria. So the reason why war is wrong, according to just war theorists, is it doesn't meet the criteria that they set out. And it's quite an obvious point, but it's just, I want to really belabor it to make sure that you understand fully why we're looking at this today. Okay, before we have a quick break, are there any questions so far? Okay. Today's lecture breaks nicely up into 3 parts. So we're going to have a quick break now, and the quick break kind of in about another half an hour or so. So break for about 3 minutes, maybe 11:35 we'll start again. I've got a quiz for you if you are interested as well. Or a puzzle. Yes. Yeah, you absolutely.
Okay, so I do the
Just
gender
leave it
war
interested.
militarism. I do the gender war militarism as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yes,
So, okay, so I might, I'm sort of sure just.
yeah, I'm relaxed. You'll be fine. We didn't come too much. It's the main
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to give you the answer to this in the next break. Can I check for those of you that came in a little bit late? Have a look at this. Our seminar tutorial times, our tutorial rooms are changing. In case you missed that, I'm going to post it on Blackboard as well. No, not times. I meant just the group, the room. Yeah, it's on the handout. Yeah, sorry, I completely forgot. Yeah, the seats is 766635. It's on the handout, in case you missed it. Okay, let's get started again. So the first part of the lecture, I introduced just war theory, go give you some basics, how we shall understand it. Now I want to get into the content of it and to come through start with a list of the principles of jus ad bellum. Now these principles, jus ad bellum, concern the pre-war phase. It's important to remember that it's at the point that the war is about to be launched. These are the things that states or other entities should look at. Really important to emphasize. So they're not post hoc. There, you need to think at the time that the decision was made, was the right decision made? So, for instance, if you're replacing Joe Biden and deciding to take military action against North Korea, you'll look to these sorts of criteria. It's what your intelligence, your military advisors, your cabinet, all the information that you've got. Suppose that they tell you it's all going to be great, all the reasonable information you can get, and you go to war. 5 years down the line, the situation is a complete mess. There's a load of stuff happened that you couldn't have predicted, such as a huge natural disaster, fueled a conflict, I don't know, over basic food stuff or whatever. That doesn't mean that your original action is wrong. Rather, on the principles of jus ad bellum, it's at the time the decision is made. So hindsight is not relevant here. So just war theorists tend to come up with about 6 or 7 principles of jus ad bellum. This is going to be quite straightforward. I'm just going to run through them. It's going to get a bit more complicated when we go over to jus in bello in the next part. So the first one, just cause. This requires that there must be good reason to go to war. So think about the 2003 war in Iraq. Were the circumstances in Iraq, in particular the threat of the weapons of mass destruction, sufficiently serious? In other words, when can the state have a just cause for war? Now, according to Michael Walzer, most prominent just war theorist of recent times, he argues that it's only for reasons of self-defense that states can legitimately go to war. So if Mali suddenly invades Burkina Faso's got a just cause to respond. Ukraine, he would argue, just cause to respond to Russia. War of self-defense. Now, in doing so, Michael Walzer largely defends the principle of non-intervention. But he does accept that the principle of non-intervention, there are some exceptions, and one is for humanitarian intervention. He says that states can justifiably intervene in response to the massive violation of basic human rights. In what he uses this odd term, which is acts that shock the moral conscience of mankind. And he wrote this in 1977, and so apologies for the very gendered language, but the acts that shock the moral consciousness of humankind, you can think. Now, Waltz's account of humanitarian intervention, very hotly debated, and the issue is not whether he thought humanitarian intervention is justifiable, rather it's that a lot of people have argued that it's too restrictive. Waltz sets the bar too high. His notion of what constitutes an atrocity is very vague. What is an act that shocks the conscience of humankind? And so the critics argue that he allows for too few humanitarian interventions. Now, Walzer then later amended his view in a piece called The Argument About Humanitarian Intervention. So that's one view, Michael Waltz's view. Mainly non-intervention, exception. What about R2P? What does R2P say about just cause? Remember the R2P, last week we went through different iterations of it. The first, according to the ISIS version, the ICISS version, the initial report, remember, this report that the Canadian government came up with. It's got a much more permissive one. It says serious and irreparable harm occurring to human beings or imminently likely to occur, and in particular actual or apprehended large-scale loss of life or large-scale ethnic cleansing. But this, recall, was seen as too permissive by states, and so the 2005 UN World Summit, they held that there's only just cause in the much more limited circumstances of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So that's humanitarian intervention. So for just cause, the two main ones, to repeat, are self-defense and potentially something humanitarian intervention. Now, how you understand self-defense has been stretched at times. And the Bush administration, any of you know what they came up with? So there was something called the Bush Doctrine. And this had anticipatory self-defense. And that was the idea that you could essentially attack before someone attacked you. Now, most just war theorists viewed that as not just cause and not how we should understand self-defense. Instead, they emphasized that it needs to be imminent or ongoing. The attack. Okay. So that's just cause. Virtually every just war thinker thinks you need to have just cause. Right intention. This says that those that are waging war must do so with the right intention and not with an ulterior, self-interested agenda. But what does that mean? How do we understand right intention? Well, the common view is that a right intention is one that is legitimate, where you're intending the reasons of the just cause. So what I mean by that is if you're going to war for self-defense, those are the circumstances, that's the just cause that you have. You need to intend to go to war for self-defense rather than some secret ulterior motive or agenda. So you can't be going to war for revenge or punishment or financial gain. These things are all ruled out. There's only the reasons of just cause. So if you go back to the 2003 war in Iraq, this is probably the war that's received most commentary from just war theorists in, I don't know, apart from World War II. One of the most common criticisms of it was that it didn't have right intention. The argument was that although there was an argument made about self-defense, about weapons of mass destruction, however tenuous that ended up being, the real reason for the military intervention, for the action, seemed to be something different. No one quite knows, but some suggested it was to gain access to Iraqi oil fields. Some suggested it was to showcase American power in the light of after the 9/11 attacks, and to kind of show the world that America was still hegemon. So the point of right intention is that whatever just cause is, if it's self-defense, you've got to go to reasons for self-defense rather than something else. If you're going to war for humanitarian intervention, if you're going to intervene in Libya or Kosovo or Bosnia, you need to intend to do so to save the people rather than another reason. I'll give you another example. I mentioned last week that Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979 to stop the Khmer Rouge. They were doing a really awful genocide. Now, sometimes it's suggested that Vietnam, they had just cause, but their intention was not really to stop the genocide, it was to increase its regional power. So some would argue that if that's true, then they didn't have right intention. Okay. Third criteria, legitimate authority. Again, war in Iraq, one of the main criticisms of it, it didn't have UN Security Council authorization. French and the Russians vetoed it. And this highlights the importance of legitimate authority. Legitimate authority says that for the war to be just, those undertaking it need to have proper authorization. They need to be the legitimate bodies to do it. So it can't be any random group that can legitimately go to war. So as a class, we can't decide to wage war. I don't know, who would we wage war on? Leeds University, there we go. MMU. Only states and certain super-state international institutions can wage war. So only states and super-state institutions can wage war. And when you move beyond self-defense into humanitarian intervention, you need to have the authorization of the UN Security Council. So self-defense, legally, if you're a state, you can justifiably defend your own borders.
Sorry, just a question. With the Iraq war, was it a UN General Assembly or?
Use the UN Security Council.
Did it go to a General Assembly vote, or did it just pass straight past it?
I can't recall whether it went to a General Assembly vote, but the UN Security Council was where all the action is. So do you remember the UN Security Council has special responsibility for peace and security matters. It would be a regional organisation. One example might be the Economic Community of West African States that I mentioned last week, or it might be the European Union. So if you're waging war of self-defense, to have legitimate authority, you need to be a state. If you're engaged in humanitarian intervention, you have to have UN Security Council authorization. Now, you might wonder why it's morally important to have UN Security Council authorization. In 1999, NATO led the intervention in Kosovo to try to protect the Kosovan Albanians. And remember, last week I said that it didn't have UN Security Council authorization. Does that matter? UN Security Council is fairly unrepresentative. UK, US, Russia, China and France are the permanent members of the UN Security Council with veto powers. No representative from the Global South. UK and France, kind of now middling powers, but they've still got permanent seats. Why does it matter morally that war be authorized by them? By it. On the other hand, you might think it's important to have UN Security Council authorization because it limits the number of actors that are going to engage in these things. It's like ensuring that there's stability in international order by only allowing for humanitarian interventions when there's not major vested interests and there's not going to be a lot more instability caused by it. So that's one set of queries. Do you also need do you always need UN Security Council authorization? Second set of queries is what about just wars by rebel groups? Which rebel group is that? Anyone know? Did you put your hand up? No. No one want to guess which rebel group that is?
Star Wars.
Star Wars, yeah, it's the Rebel Alliance from Star Wars. So, why is it only a state can wage war? Does this mean that violent rebellion by rebels is always impermissible? So we might want to water this down. That doesn't seem right. They might be fighting a just cause, with good intentions, as the rebels were. What then do the rebels need to do to be legitimate? Now, it's very difficult for rebels to be democratic. You might think, well, they need to be democratically organised, some sort of good system, because, after all, they're rebels and they're not in power. More established groups can have forms of representation, but it seems much harder for rebel groups that don't have the ability to coordinate and cooperate to the same degree. So does it matter that the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars was not a democracy? We might still think that they were fighting a just cause. So just war theorists have been increasingly looking at these questions of the ethics of rebellion and how just war theory should apply to rebel groups, and broadening out how they understand legitimate authority to include wars by what seem like just rebel groups. Trying to remember where to put on your handout. Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting pieces on the handout if you're interested in these things. So there's a paper by Alan Buchanan and there's a book by Chris Finlay. Okay, that video's in the wrong place. I'll come back to it in a second. Shall I go for it now?
The question before the House today is how to respond to one of the most abhorrent uses of chemical weapons in a century, slaughtering innocent men, women and children in Syria. It is not about taking sides in the Syrian conflict. It is not about invading. It is not about regime change or even working more closely with the opposition. It is about the large-scale use of chemical weapons and our response to a war crime, nothing else.
The weapons inspectors are in the midst of their work and will be reporting in the coming days. That is why today could not have been the day when the House was asked to decide on military action. For this House, it is surely a basic point. Evidence should precede decision, not decision precede evidence.
Listening to this speech, any reasonable human being would assume that the gentleman is looking to divide the House for political advantage. What has happened to the... What has happened? What has happened to the national interest?
I have to say that intervention is not worthy of the honourable gentleman.
The fact the Syrian government has and has used chemical weapons is beyond doubt. The fact that the most recent attack took place is not seriously doubted. The Syrian government has said it took place, and the evidence that the Syrian regime has used these weapons in the early hours of the 21st of August is right in front of our eyes.
If the decision, as some of us believe, has already been made in Washington and agreed by the government here, then that's really why we're here, because Washington feels there should be some bombs falling this weekend.
At this very moment, the Assad regime in Damascus are watching very carefully as to whether they will get away with what they have done. If there is no international response of a significant kind, then we can be absolutely certain that the forces within Damascus will be successful in saying, well, we must continue to use these whenever there is a military rationale for doing so.
The Syrian rebels have got plenty of access to sarin. It's not rocket science, Mr. Speaker. You don't have to be Einstein to have your hands on sarin gas or the means to distribute it. Russia and China say no to war. So do I and most people in this country.
From all the evidence we have, the fact that opposition don't have chemical weapons, the fact the regime do, the fact they've used it, the fact they were attacking the area at the time, and that intelligence I've reported, that is enough to conclude that the regime is responsible and should be held accountable.
It is no more pleasant to be killed by a cruise missile than it is to be killed by gas. You're still dead.
Okay. That video is a summary of the debate about the potential for military action in Syria after the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. And the vote went against the government, went against the Cameron government. And it was an important moment because it actually meant that the UK decided not to engage in a bombing campaign against Syria. And that in turn meant that the US would have been isolated, and the US then did not engage in a large-scale bombing campaign against the Assad regime. It did end up bombing ISIS in Syria, for that was for different reasons, but at that moment it decided not to do so. Now this highlights the importance of what you might think is the fourth criterion, which you might think is important. It's called the formal declaration of war. Now this is one of the principles that's probably most contested in the literature, and it's unclear on exactly why we should view it as important. The way that I think it's best to understand it is that those undertaking war must formally and properly declare that they're about to do so, so they need to openly declare war. And what's more important is that they need to follow certain parliamentary and constitutional constraints. So we had one. That's the parliamentary constraint. There needed to be a debate and a vote on the war. The UK didn't always have this constraint. It was brought in relatively recently. In the US, there's what's called the War Powers Resolution. The War Powers Resolution. Now, one of the criticisms of the NATO intervention in Libya was that the war didn't receive proper authorization from the US Congress under the War Powers Resolution. The Obama administration found a way around it. So you can view this as that war, then therefore lacking this. What you'll see is referred to as the formal declaration of war, but you might think it is something like the proper declaration of war, or the proper internal approval of war. So one of the objections to it you'll find in some of the literature that it's anachronistic and only a formality. Why should you declare war? After all, if you declare war, it's going to make it very easy for your opponent to respond. It'd be much, much better if you've got just cause, right intention, to do so quickly and not to say you're about to wage war. Is to understand it as this following parliamentary and constitutional constraints. And we might think that these constraints in turn are important because it helps to constrain prime ministers and presidents. And it helps to ensure that as citizens, we can hold our politicians to account. We can look at their voting records, we can see how they voted in this voting decision whether to go to war in Syria. It's all online, and you can use that to decide how you're going to vote in the next election. So in other words, it can help with the democratic control of force. The democratic control of force. Okay, fifth criterion. We're getting through them. Now, it's often said that war is hell, and according to this criterion, because of this, war should be the last resort. It should be the thing that we try to avoid. Now, this is, of all the criteria that we're looking at today, this is the most important one for the module. And it's most important because it highlights that you should be engaged in other methods rather than going to war. Again, the criticism often made of the Iraq War was that it was not the last resort. The criticism was that the weapons inspectors were not given sufficient time. Hans Blix, any of you heard of Hans Blix? Yeah. He was the UN weapons inspector in 2003, the war in Iraq. UN weapons inspector, he was going around trying to find these supposed weapons of mass destruction. Surprise, surprise, he couldn't find any. The argument was that he wasn't given enough time to do so. War wasn't the last resort. They could have sent the inspectors back again. Now, last resort has been subject to quite a lot of attention. So you might wonder why war should be the last resort. Suppose that you could wage war quickly. Surgical strike doesn't cause many civilian casualties. I suppose the leading alternative would be a comprehensive economic sanctions regime that causes lots of destruction and harm in the country that's the target of it. You might think sometimes it's better to wage a quick surgical war rather than a sanctions regime that causes lots of destruction. So the reply here is that sometimes it's better to wage war because the other options will be even worse. And next week we're going to look at the criticisms of economic sanctions in more detail, exploring the main objection of them, and in particular comprehensive sanctions that caused havoc in Iraq in the 1990s. Now there's another problem too. Last resort is often understood literally. So war should literally be the last option, the last thing to do. The problem with the literal account is that all peaceful options have to be tried. But you can continue trying peaceful options. You can continue trying more diplomacy. You can continue just doing more economic measures. Another diplomatic note, another UN Security Council resolution, another meeting, as Michael Walzer argues. So this means that war is never an option if you understand last resort literally. So given these, there's been amending to how we understand last resort, amendments to it, and prompted non-literal accounts of last resort, non-literal accounts. So one of these is what's called the reasonable chance account. Reasonable chance account, and this holds that only peaceful options that have a reasonable chance of success should be tried first. Now this improves on the reasonable chance, on the literal account. So, for instance, if endless diplomacy doesn't have a reasonable chance of succeeding, then it's not required to be pursued. There's only things that might work. But there's a problem with this understanding as well. And this is that the options that do have reasonable chances might still be pretty problematic. For instance, if economic sanctions might have a reasonable chance of addressing mass atrocities, but are likely to cause huge devastation on a scale much larger than a bombing campaign, sanctions would still have to be pursued before war could be permissible. So the problem then is that the reasonable chance account is that it doesn't require a proper evaluation of the costs and the benefits of the various options. It only focuses on one thing, whether they've got reasonable chances, rather than about all the various forms of harms that they might bring about or benefits they might bring about. So this leads to a third version of last resort, which says that we should understand it as requiring the measure that will cause the least amount of harm. The least awful account, it's called. And this is proposed by a political philosopher called Simon Caney. And this argues that unlike the reasonable chance account, there is a comparative element to it. It requires that the various costs and benefits be weighed to see which one's going to be the least bad, the least awful, which is going to cause the least amount of harm. So you weigh up economic sanctions and diplomacy and war, and whichever one's the least awful, then you go with that. Now, this seems like it's an improvement, but Eamon Aloyu, whose articles amongst the required reading this week, argues that this account is specious. And this is because he claims it's not really a principle of last resort, this least awful account. It fails to indicate why war, in particular, should be attempted after all the other options have been tried first. In other words, it loses any notion of lastness. There's nothing lastness about this principle of last resort. And Aloyu embraces that. He thinks that we should choose the best option, which will often not be war, but this isn't about war being the last resort. The potential best options are those that we're going to look at later in the module. So, this principle of last resort seems really important. It's difficult to explain why we should value lastness as important. This is Aloyu's challenge. Okay, on to proportionality. This is the final one we're going to look at. This is pretty straightforward. It says that war must be likely to do more good than harm. Now, the most obvious way you might think is to be victorious, to do more good than harm, to have victory. And it's wrong to wage war if you're not likely to be victorious. But is it enough to be victorious? So, hopefully some of you see.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Be seated, please. Thank you all very much. Admiral Kelly, Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty and for the peace of the world. Our nation and our coalition are proud of this accomplishment. Yet it is you, the members of the United States military, who achieved it. Your courage, your willingness to face danger for your country and for each other made this day possible.
Okay, so that's a very famous hubristic speech by George W. Bush, mission accomplished speech. In one sense, he was right. They did secure victory. They defeated Saddam. They removed him. But the war seems like it did a lot more harm than good overall. So it doesn't look like victory is enough. Now, according to The Independent, the war led to the death of 179 UK servicemen and women, about 4,000 US military deaths, in between 100,000 to 600,000 Iraqi civilian deaths, cost the UK about £10 billion, led to about 4 million refugees fleeing, various estimates of how much it cost the US, including the war in Afghanistan, up to 6 or 7 trillion once they factor in the payments to veterans. 6 or 7 trillion. So it doesn't look like it's enough to focus on the likelihood of victory alone. The principle of proportionality requires that you consider all of the various costs and benefits of war. Now, proportionality helps us think through this a bit more. So we can look at the various ways that a war might be disproportionate. The firstly is excessive internal costs. So what I mean by that is on the state waging the war, excessive internal costs for the state waging the war. It might be the expense of it, or it might be the result in the large number of casualties on your side. Amongst soldiers or amongst your civilians, it's going to be too expensive in terms of resources or in terms of casualties. Then you can also think about the external costs, excessive external costs. And this is for the other party, the other belligerent. These are in terms of the number of civilians that might die, the havoc that war might lead to in that country, destruction of public infrastructure, the harms to enemy soldiers, harms to hospitals, for instance. So the costs, external costs. And the third is the excessive costs on third parties. So what I mean by those are that those that aren't directly involved in the war. This includes neighbouring states. And neighbouring states might be harmed as the war spills over into it. They might have to deal with huge refugee flows that put pressure on their public services, and their trade might be severely harmed. The war in Ukraine is said to have harmed lots of people around the world because of the disruption in terms of the grain supplies. So this is a way of thinking about it more systematically. Think about the internal costs, the external costs, and those on third parties. Now, just to get a sense of the destructiveness of what we're looking at today, this is Aleppo. Years ago, it shows the destruction of Aleppo in Syria after the Syrians. In terms of the excessive external and internal costs for those.
It's very scary, and first time I listen الرصاص شو اسمه 18 كانوا جريح 80 ميت.
أنا دائما بحلم بوحوش.
Now, I just want to highlight one point. We're going to take another break in a minute. That sometimes the situation might be so bad that the proportionate thing to do would still potentially go to war, despite all the costs involved. And this was increasingly argued about the situation in Syria. It was claimed that the US should have acted because although there would have been lots of costs, the cost in terms of inaction was even worse. The inaction was even worse. Now, what I want to highlight here is, regardless of whether you think that was a right or wrong claim, is that proportionality depends on the counterfactual. What that means is that the costs of not going to war, of inaction, so you compare it to the counterfactual. So, excessive internal, external costs on the third parties compared to what would have happened if you'd have gone to war, if you hadn't gone to war. Rather than just knowing nothing, if you compare it to what would have happened otherwise. So look to the counterfactual. Final point is, I want to highlight, sometimes you'll encounter a principle called the reasonable hope of success, or the reasonable prospect of success. This is largely covered, I think, by the principle of proportionality, and I think it's better to see it as part of it. But sometimes you will see it as a separate principle. And this says that if you're going to wage war, it needs to be likely to be successful. Okay, so that's the end of the discussion of principles of jus ad bellum. You've probably got views on whether those principles are important or not, and we're going to look at that in the seminars this week. After the next break, we're going to go on to the principles of jus in bello. Right. I should start one of the again. Okay, let's have another few-minute break. So we'll start back at 25 past. War itself and lots of different definitions of war. So some people think it needs to be I would view that there's questions about this. Whether that should be we used to cover actually some we'll look at a little bit when we get to Simon. So has anyone worked this out? Anyone got an answer? You want to take a guess? $31. No, it's not 31. Anyone else want to try? 30, no. Higher or lower than 30? It's lower than 30. Okay, I won't keep any suspense anymore. It's 17. Did anyone get 17? Quietly, modestly. I guess if you're that modest, you're not going to put your hand up. Okay. So we've looked at the principles of jus ad bellum. Those are the ones about when you're going to resort to war. Now we're going to turn to the principles of jus in bello. Remember, these are restrictions on what you can do during war. So these are the things that when you're waging war, you have to follow. Now we're going to focus on two principles, but the first one we're going to look at in a lot more detail because there's been a lot of discussion about it in recent times. And this is the principle of discrimination. On this principle, it says that you must discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate targets, so between soldiers and civilians. Michael Walzer, who we looked at in the first part of the lecture, strongly endorses this. Now, this has got two parts to it. The first is what's called the moral equality of soldiers. And this says that it's acceptable to target soldiers, sometimes called combatants in the literature, because they've been made into a dangerous person, and though their operations may have been few, it's nevertheless accurate to say that they have been allowed themselves to be made into a dangerous person. So this is Michael Walzer arguing that there's a moral equality of soldiers. Everyone's dangerous, everyone's a threat. You can legitimately target them. It's the dangerousness that matters here. They're a threat means that you can target them. Doesn't matter what they're fighting for. By being a soldier, they are legitimate game. Out of interest, who of you agree with that idea that soldier is a legitimate target, regardless of what they're fighting for? You want to show hands if you think that's right? You show your hands if you think it's wrong. Okay, we'll come and do that test again in a little while. Okay, so that's the first part, moral equality of soldiers. The second part is the principle of non-combatant immunity. This is simply the idea that it's wrong, impermissible to directly target civilians. You can't directly target civilians. Civilians are not legitimate targets in war. War should be between soldiers. Again, put your hands up. Who thinks that's a good principle? Any of you think that it needs amending? Interesting, okay. Now, Walzer also presents a caveat to non-combatant immunity that he calls, that's called the doctrine of double effect. Now, the doctrine of double effect generally holds that it's impermissible to target directly civilians. But this doesn't mean that all civilian casualties are wrong. On the contrary, you can harm civilians if it's collateral damage when you're aiming at a military target. collateral damage when aiming at a military target. So even if we foresee that civilians may die, this is permissible as long as we don't target them directly or aiming at military targets. So I'll give you an example. Suppose that there's a whole load of military lorries. Next to the lorries are civilian cars. In taking out the military lorries, we foresee that we're also going to hit some civilian cars. Now, according to the doctrine of double effect, that is permissible because you're not intending to target the civilians. Now, Walter has a formulation of the doctrine of double effect. There's various versions of it. Walter's got a nice clear formulation, so this is what you can use as the basis of it. So he says that there are two effects of it. There needs to be a good effect. There needs to be some sort of benefit to the military action, say the destruction of the military lorries. Then you need to intend to bring about the good effect. So you need to intend the destruction of the military lorries rather than, say, attacking the civilian cars. Any bad effect has to be an unintentional side effect. Thirdly, the bad effect, so destruction of civilian cars, needs to be outweighed by the benefits in terms of the good effect. So it needs to be more important to destroy the military lorries rather than it is to compared to the destruction of the cars. So it needs to be very good for the war effort in terms of destroying the military lorries. It might make a major difference to the war. And fourthly, and this is something that Walter adds particularly for himself, is that not only must the intention of the actor be good, the actor, when aware of the evil involved, seeks to minimize it, accepting costs to himself or themselves. The point here is that when you're likely to bring about harm with its bad effects, you need to try and reduce the costs, reduce the harms. So, for instance, if you're conducting an aerial bombing campaign, you need to fly lower to try to make sure that you're minimizing the harm to civilian casualties. You're accepting costs to yourself, more likely to be blown up, brought down to reduce the civilian casualties. Ensure the bombs are more accurate. So, the doctrine of double effect. This is a way of allowing for some civilian casualties in war justifiably when you're fighting a just war. Because otherwise you might think you're never ever, if a war's always going to kill some civilians, this is a way of potentially doing it in a way that's the civilian casualty is still regrettable, Walter argues, but potentially morally justifiable. You're not intending them. The good effect outweighs the bad one. Now, there are various challenges to the doctrine of double effect. Now, one of them is that there's a dubious distinction between what you intend and what you foresee, but do not intend. So take two cases. Suppose that a state intends to attack an enemy base and a neighbouring school, and the result is a much higher number of civilian casualties. A high number of civilian casualties. And the second case, the state intends to attack the school, but only, and then foresees that it's going to bring about the destruction of the enemy base. Why does it matter what the state intends? In the same two cases, it's going to be exactly the same result. Destruction of the school and the military base. So some argue that this relevance and intention on what you're foreseeing isn't strong enough. It doesn't provide a sufficient cover to justify the doctrine of double effect. Now, that's a challenge to the principle of the doctrine of double effect. It's also an important challenge to McMahon's, to Waltz's central principle of discrimination. And this comes from what in recent just war theory is called the revisionist movement, the revisionist approach to just war theory. Jeff McMahon is a leading proponent. There are others. Cecile Fabre, whose work I've mentioned a few times already, another leading proponent. Others on the reading list, such as Alan Froh, Seth Lazar, and so on. Now, remember that Waltzer says that moral equality, soldiers can be killed because they're viewed as dangerous. He defends this moral equality, soldiers are all dangerous. McMahon argues that soldiers that are fighting for just causes, even if they're dangerous, are not legitimate targets. So it would be wrong, for instance, to target those in Ukraine defending themselves against Russian aggression. They're not legitimate targets. They've been forced to fight. They're morally innocent. They're doing nothing wrong in defending themselves. And to kill them is akin to murder, McMahon argues. It would violate their right not to be killed. On the other hand, he argues that soldiers that are fighting for unjust causes are legitimate targets. So if you're fighting in an unjust war, you're legitimate gain. But if you're fighting for a just cause, you're doing nothing wrong, and so it's not right that you should be killed. It's not right that those in World War II fighting the Nazis should have been killed. Just because they were dangerous, they were armed, doesn't mean that they are morally liable to be killed. So that's the first challenge, first central challenge that McMahon and the other revisionists pose to the principles that Waltzer offers. Secondly, McMahon and other revisionists challenge the principle of non-combatant immunity. McMahon argues that it can sometimes be permissible to target certain civilians. Specifically, those civilians, such as politicians, who are morally liable for the war. So civilians that are morally liable for the war. They're the ones that are responsible for bringing it about. You could target them. It gives an example of the United Fruit Company, which is the backdrop to the slide, in Guatemala in the 1950s. The directors of the company, the US company, feared that the democratically elected government's intention of purchasing uncultivated land from the company and redistributing amongst Native American peasants. They didn't like this idea. They didn't want the government to do this. So they heavily pressured the US government, who then, through the CIA, overthrew the democratic government of Guatemala. So McMahon argues that although they were civilians, if attacking the directors of the United Fruit Company at the time would have been as effective at attacking soldiers in preventing the coup, then it would have been permissible to do so. So sometimes it's permissible, he argues, to target directly civilians when they're morally responsible and so liable. So we've got this twofold important challenge here. Well, Waltzer offers this principle of discrimination, says that if you're soldiers are legitimate gain, civilians aren't. McMahon and other revisionists are arguing actually You need to look at what the people are doing. And if you're a soldier, if you're fighting a just cause, then you're not a legitimate target. And if you're a civilian, morally responsible, then you might potentially be a legitimate target. Okay, out of interest, who still thinks that there should be the moral equality of soldiers, kind of Wart's principle? You want to raise your hands? Interesting. Who now thinks that some soldiers aren't legitimate again? Okay, a few more. What about civilians? Who still strongly believes in non-combatant immunity? Okay. And who thinks that non-combatant immunity can sometimes be foregone and that we should favour the revisionist view? Okay, interesting. So it changed a bit. Okay, now there's been, as I've alluded to, there are a lot of vigorous debates in the literature on these arguments. Being that books and articles, we could have a whole module just on this stuff. One of the main arguments is that whether McMahon's views are dangerous. Michael Wartzer and others have responded that if we remove the blanket prohibition on targeting civilians, then many more civilians might die. The thought is that if we view them as sometimes legitimate targets, then soldiers are going to view all civilians as some legitimate targets. And we need to maintain this. In practice, we need to maintain non-combatant immunity. So there's worry about whether they're dangerous when we put them into practice. Now, I should say that McMahon accepts that to some degree. And he argues that his view is only one in principle. Now, the second query I want to raise is that whether McMahon's views will actually lead to pacifism. For revisionists, war isn't wrong simply because it harms innocent civilians. It's also wrong because it harms innocent soldiers. And this adds to the overall harms of war. It adds to the disproportionateness of war. This adds to all of the other problems. So this might lead to pacifism. It's not only wrong not to harm civilians, it's also wrong not to harm various soldiers. And this is what Larry May argues. He says, if what makes soldiers liable to attack is the threat that they pose, then fine range determinations need to be made among soldiers, and such determinations make support for fighting even just wars where enemy soldiers as well as civilians are normally killed indiscriminately very difficult to justify, because the concern for those that are innocent not to be killed. So what Larry May is arguing here is it's going to be very difficult to determine the soldiers that are fighting for just reasons, doing things that are right in war, compared to those that are not. It's very difficult to discriminate. It's going to mean in wars, going to be a lot more wrongs involved in wars, and that's going to potentially tip the balance in favour of pacifism. Now, there are various responses to that. McMahon argues that we can have rules of thumb. You can say that certain soldiers we do know were morally responsible. So we know, for instance, that the Iraqi Republican Guard in the first Gulf War was a highly paid elite volunteer force, and we can view them as generally morally responsible. Very different to the poor Iraqi conscripts who had no choice but to fight, and we can try and target the elite forces rather than the poor conscripts. So you might have a rule of thumb. You might accept Larry May's arguments and think that pacifism is right, or a form of pacifism. Or you might reject revisionism and the arguments and think that we shouldn't focus on these questions of individual liability. There's an important statement by Tammy Measles' book. I'm trying to get in for the library. We've been trying for years to get this, but hopefully it will come in. important statement of the Waltzerian view. So, this is the principle of discrimination. Generally says you can't target civilians, you can target soldiers. Doctrine of double effect says that you can harm civilians but not target them, provided certain conditions are met. And then revisionists come along and say we should understand moral equality of soldiers and discrimination differently. We should focus on the liability. Okay. Quickly now, the second major jus in bello principle. This is the principle of proportionality. I'm going to say very little about this. These are the tactics used within war. It says that the means used need to be appropriate. You need to use limited force, only what is necessary to remove the threat. So say, for instance, that a few lightly armed Russian soldiers are in a building somewhere in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian forces could enter the building and arrest them pretty easily. However, they decide instead to drop a 10-ton bomb, flattening all of them. Now, this response would be viewed as unnecessary and disproportionate. So it's only what's proportionate. Okay, before I wrap up, are there any questions?
What's the grey area when it's civilians in a combat zone which are somewhat aiding either it's a free fighters or the ones who are morally wrong? How do you approach that?
Excellent question. There's not a clear-cut answer. Just theories have explored exactly that. So Cecile Fabre has got a paper called Guns, Food and Liability that considers those sorts of questions in particular. So how do you deal with civilians that are part of the war effort? Some people think that they're all fair game. Some people think that they aren't. She thinks that you need to have a threshold of contribution, so you need to be doing a certain amount, and then you can become liable. Her view is controversial, though. I don't have a clear cut, but it's good. No, so some people think that it's degree of culpability, some people think it's degree of causality, and some people think none of them are fair game. Good, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, let me wrap up then. So, we've looked at the principles of jus in bello, jus ad bellum, critique of war implied by just war theory. They don't meet these criteria that we've looked at. To finish, I want to raise a query. And this concerns the relevance of just war theory. You might think that no one's ever going to meet these criteria and leaders will never obey them. Instead, leaders are always going to be concerned with the national interest. However, you will find that many rulers and leaders use the language of just war theory all the time when discussing warfare.
And over time, as codes of law sought to control violence within groups, so did philosophers and clerics and statesmen seek to regulate the destructive power of war. The concept of a just war emerged, suggesting that war is justified only when certain conditions were met. If it is waged as a last resort or in self-defense, if the force used is proportional, and if, whenever possible, civilians are spared from violence. Of course, we know that for most of history, this concept of just war was rarely observed.
You'll find that just war theory has permeated a lot of discussions about Ukraine, a lot of discussions about Gaza. It's much harder, for instance, to find a general saying, it doesn't matter how many civilians we will kill, what matters is the military objectives. Just war theory permeates lots of the practical thinking of warfare. But this leads to a final kind of query I want to raise, and some of the literature discusses this. And this is the objection that just war theory also, in addition to providing a way of constraining war, enables it as well. it has such force, such public, permeation within the general public and thinking about warfare, that it's a way of enabling wars by thinking that wars can sometimes be justified. Okay. Thank you very much. Next week we're going to be looking at the main alternatives to war, which is, at least on the face of it, and that's economic sanctions. Reminder, for those of you that don't know, for those of you who missed it, room change for the seminars.
So why just like to climate change?
Yeah.
Like how does adjustable theory
deal with climate? So that's a great question. So that's something we're going to look at actually in the 8th lecture.
Yeah.
I haven't written it yet, but it's.
It's like the consequence. You have to look at the consequences if they counteract, but like looking at markets and past set at all, but like the amount of CO2 that's been emitted.
Yeah, so the US military is one of the biggest global climate change emitters, CO2, and all wars cause huge climate change emissions. So that's one thing we'll look at, and then the other thing is whether actually, rather than fighting any wars or tackling mass atrocity, all we should do is because given the potential harms, so it's how we should prioritise between these various other things that states should be doing.
Yeah, security.
Yeah, rather than peace and security and atrocities, whether we should global health is another one we're going to mention. So people don't realise how many people die from preventable diseases. We tend to massively overemphasise death from violent conflict.
And the other thing was like I did a reading for my research project on like just warriors versus beautiful souls.
Okay, yeah.
Which was so like how gender has been used like in just wars. And yeah, that's just another thing. Yeah, I think I might switch to it, but do you have a course guide I could look at?
If you email it.
I'll email. Okay.
Yeah.
Just it was also like other things, not just like this was so interesting.
Yeah, great.
There's like other things to think about, but thank you so much.
No worries, no worries. And there's no pressure, whatever you want to do.
So I was wondering about security studies and the politics thing. And,
yeah, sure, come on. I'm just making sure I'm logged out.
I was wondering about like, I guess career side of politics and security studies.